These are the best settings for Warzone Season 1 Reloaded, making sure that we're getting the highest FPS possible, improved visibility of our enemies, whilst keeping our latency as low as possible. Starting off in the display tab of the graphics settings, display mode, you want to select between full screen exclusive and full screen borderless. Don't select either of the other two. Basically, it's a bit of a trade-off here. Exclusive is better in terms of latency than borderless, because borderless can allow basically things to be running in the background, whilst exclusive, in the name, it's giving all of the priority to the game. But full screen borderless means you can alt tab a little bit smoother if you're someone who likes to multitask, if you're a content creator or something like that. I would personally say for pure performance, full screen exclusive is your best bet. Display monitor, display adapter, and screen refresh rate, just make sure all of these are set correctly based on your hardware. So you've got the correct monitor, the correct GPU, and the correct refresh rate for your monitor. Display resolution, leave this at automatic. It should select your native resolution. If you want to gain some FPS by downscaling your resolution, if you're on a lower cost build, then we can do that later on, not from this setting. Then aspect ratio, you want to leave this just to automatic. There are some funky things you can do in terms of getting stretched resolution and black bars and stuff like that, which I've seen some people do. Maybe I'll do a video on that in the future. But for most people out there, just leave it to automatic and it will select the correct aspect ratio for your monitor. Then we've got a restart shaders preloading option. I said this before, this is a useful option if you run into any problems with corrupted shaders. Basically, if you're noticing any weird artifacting in game where you see weird things popping in and out, or your game's just stuttering, come in here, run this shader preload restart, and it will reload those shaders in for you. Display gamma, we've got two options, 2.2 and 2.4. If you're on a monitor, keep it to 2.2. If you're playing on a TV screen for some reason with your PC, then 2.4 should look better. Brightness, it starts off at a default of 50, but I'd recommend that you raise this up to a minimum of 55 or a maximum of 60. The higher you go, the more washed out it gets, but I find that putting it in this range just bumps some of those dark corners, those areas where certain operators can hide on the map, and it can really help you out with visibility overall. Then we've got constrained mouse to game window. This will only be available if you have your display mode set to borderless, because in theory, then you could roll your mouse off the screen. It's personal preference. You can turn this on and then you could let your mouse go onto the screen. Helps with multitasking, but for full screen exclusive, it doesn't really matter. Then NVIDIA Reflex Low Latency, you want this at on or on plus boost. The choice of which one you pick is dependent on what your build is like for your PC, especially in regards to your CPU and your GPU. So on plus boost, as you can see over here, is specifically for CPU bound cases. So if your CPU is considerably weaker than your GPU, then you want to turn this to on plus boost. Whereas if you've got a bit more of a balanced build, or just a very strong CPU, like I do in my PC, then on will perform better. So if you don't know which one to pick, try out both, see which one performs better, but you should base it ideally off of your CPU and GPU. Then eco mode preset, turn this to custom. Having it on either of these other options are gonna play around with energy consumption and power settings, not something we want to control from within the game, so just set it to custom. VSync gameplay and VSync menus, I would recommend both of these that you keep to off. VSync will help out with screen tearing. As you can see over here, it reduces screen tearing by limiting the frame rate of the game to the refresh rate of your monitor. But what this also does is it adds a lot of input latency. So it's highly recommended that you keep this off. Also, the higher refresh rate of the monitor you get, once you start to get to 144 or even 240 hertz, you won't really see screen tearing anyway, because the refresh rate is so high. Then custom frame rate limit. A lot of people will put this to unlimited just to get the max FPS everywhere, but the smarter thing to do is to keep it a custom, click show more, and then we can customize the individual frame rate limits depending on whether we're in-game, in the menus, or tabbed out of the game and looking at something else. So the advantage here is we can set our gameplay custom frame rate limit all the way up to 300, so the maximum that it can go to, which is obviously very nice. Then menu custom frame rate limit, I like to leave this at something pretty smooth, especially because the menu custom frame rate limit affects when you're in the firing range. So I've been going with something like 140, kind of similar to our 144 hertz monitor, but it's not pushing to the kind of crazy amounts of FPS that the game can actually get when I'm in the game. So it just saves a little bit of power. And then for the out of focus frame rate limit, you can bring this all the way down to 5, because when I alt tab and do something over here, I don't want the game taking any resource. I don't want to be in my Chrome, like Google Chrome browser, doing internet browsing and it's lagging because COD's main menu CPU is taking up loads of resource. Just turn it all the way down and you will see better performance in that multitasking. Focus mode, make sure this is on 0. If you start turning this up, you can see it displays a black overlay around the game window and stuff like that. You don't want any of that happening. It's unnecessary to just turn that off. And then HDR, there's probably some testing to be done here because this should help out with getting better color on a good HDR monitor. But the problem is that most people don't have good HDR in their monitors. Even the monitor I've got, I don't feel like has good HDR. So for most people, I would recommend you keep this off to just get default colors in your game. But if you do want to play around with it, maybe have a little try and see if your monitor has good HDR that you can set up. It's personal preference. I recommend you keep it off. Now, before we cover the rest of the settings, if you are watching this video, then you must be sat with a pretty nice PC in front of you that you probably spent a decent amount of money on. I know I've probably spent about $2,000 on mine, but out the box, a lot of those components don't run as efficiently as they should do, and tuning them all up in the BIOS and stuff can be quite difficult. But luckily, I have partnered up with the guys over at FPS Hub, who offer incredibly well-priced optimization packages for overclocking of CPU and GPU and RAM and audio settings and internet optimizations, a full suite of stuff that you can get by a bunch of guys who have decades worth of experience. They actually took one of my builds that I was getting 150 FPS in the benchmark from and ran it through their PC optimization package, and I ended up on just under 180 FPS. And when you look at the price that you pay for the package, the price per FPS in comparison to the original, as I said, £2,000 I had on this build, it is really, really worth the price, and I couldn't be happier with the results I've got from it. Lucky for you guys, if you are interested in getting the actual full potential out of the components that you've bought, I do currently have a code that you can use with FPS Hub at checkout as part of my partnership with them moving forward. All you need to do is use my code FourEyes at checkout for $15 off any package that's worth over $100. I cannot recommend these guys enough. Go and check them out at the end of the video, but for now, let's continue with the settings. So moving into the quality tab now, graphic preset, you want to leave this at custom. It should change to custom anyway when we start changing things down here because we're changing off of the original preset. Render resolution, this is a percentage of your resolution that you want to render at. I'd recommend for now that you leave this at 100%, so we're just rendering out at native. We can start dialing this down if we're really needing FPS after we've covered everything else in this guide, but for now, leave it at 100. Then, dynamic resolution, this is kind of a similar thing where if you were to turn this on, you could set a target frame rate, maybe something that you don't usually hit, and it will actually dynamically adjust the resolution as you play. There's better ways to get FPS though, so I'd recommend you leave that off. Upscaling and sharpening, this is one of those ways you can gain FPS. There's actually a few different settings I will recommend here. If you're someone who has a build where you are hitting FPS that you want to hit pretty fine after we've gone through all the settings in this guide, and you just want to make the game look better, improve that visibility, improve that fidelity, well, there's nothing better to use than Fidelity FX Cast. This is just a post-processing sharpening filter, essentially, but it works really, really well and it's not grainy at all. I've been running this at a cast strength of 80. If you're playing at 1080p though, you probably want to turn this to 100 because I'm on 1440p and I find it to just be a bit overly sharp for what I need. So I like 80. But if you are running on a build where you're not getting the FPS that you want and you want to gain a little bit back, well, you want to start using one of the upscaling methods. The two ones I recommend that you try out between and see what prefers for you would be NVIDIA DLSS and AMD FSR 2.1. FSR, even though it says AMD, that will be available for NVIDIA and AMD graphics cards. NVIDIA DLSS is only available for NVIDIA cards. But for either of these, which you want to try out, you want to select the upscaling method, then go to show more, and you want to select the highest quality setting available. And then if there's a sharpening option, which DLSS has, then you want to turn this up to the max. I don't believe that AMD FSR has that. No, it just has the preset. So we'd set that to ultra quality. Try both these out and see which one looks better for you, which one gives you the most FPS. For most people who are happy with their FPS, keep it to Fidelity FX Cast with a strength of 80. Long explanation, but very, very important. Path tracing and ray reconstruction, you'll only have this available on certain RTX cards. I've got a 4080 in here. Doesn't matter though, because we are going to keep this off. This is going to make the game, like the campaign and stuff, look incredible. It's not useful for Warzone. It's not good for FPS, so keep this off. VRAM scale target. Do not max this out. Do not think that because it's setting a percentage of the target amount of VRAM to use that we want to just max it out and use the most VRAM. That's not how it works. What we found is that keeping this around 65 is a good starting value. Will actually help with stuttering a lot. When you start to raise this more than you need, you will get more stuttering and actually worse performance. So depending on the strength of your GPU, 65 might work best, and I'd say probably a max of 75 I've seen might also work. So try between those two values and see what makes the game run as smooth as possible. Then variable rate shading. This was a new setting that was added when this iteration of Warzone was released. And it is an absolute game changer. It's really, really good. What it does is it makes it so that it will drop the visuals of things that you're not focused on at any one point in the game. So if you're looking at something here, stuff in the peripherals might be lower quality, giving you better FPS, but you'll never ever notice the difference. And the boost in FPS is pretty heavy. So keep variable rate shading on for sure. Then we've got DLSS frame generation, which is only available for 40 series cards. I have seen so many fake, I call them, benchmarks on Twitter, on YouTube, from people saying that they have the best settings ever, and they're using frame generation, which actually uses AI to basically create fake frames. It makes your game have a higher FPS value, but your latency is awful using this. Do not turn this on. I might have to do a whole video testing this and proving why this is so bad, because the amount of people recommending it's killing my brain. Please keep this off. Moving on to details and textures. Texture resolution, you want to put this at low, not very low, one above the bottom. The reasoning is that very low looks way worse visual-wise, visibility-wise than low, but the FPS, very similar. You don't lose pretty much any FPS going up one setting. As you start going higher though, it's the complete opposite. You lose more and more FPS and the textures don't really look any better. So low is the best balance of FPS and visuals. Texture filter anisotropic, we can keep this at high. We do not need to lower this down on any modern PC. You gain little to no FPS from doing this, and you lose a lot of the visual crispness of textures, as you can see here, especially when you're looking at surfaces like the floor, where you're not looking at it head on. You know, you're not staring there looking at the floor directly below you, you're looking at it at an angle. That's where texture filter anisotropic or anisotropic filtering really helps out. Depth of field, yuck. We do not want blur in our peripherals. If someone comes from the side and you've got depth of field on, they're going to look like a blurry circle running onto your screen. So definitely turn that off. We do not need cinematic effects. Detail quality level, we can actually happily turn this to low. It will make certain objects in the game look a little bit weird, but you can actually gain some advantages from this. You can see here, if there was an enemy lying behind this grass, in this image on the left where it's on low, you would see them. On this image on the right, you wouldn't see them. So it makes things look worse, but you can actually just see through certain objects. It's a little bit broken, but yeah, definitely keep this on low. Then particle resolution, a real big killer to FPS. Really not good at all. So you want to turn this all the way to very low. Once again, it does heavily visually downgrade things like this thermite grenade, as well as any explosions that go off. But cutting out a lot of those particles actually helps out with your overall visibility and visuals. Really, really helps out. Next, we've got bullet impacts, which do not affect your FPS at all in game. You can be happy with that. And it's personal preference whether you have these on or off. I like to keep them on purely because I sometimes go into the firing range and I test out recoil of guns by firing at the wall and looking at the recoil plots as to where the bullets have gone. So I need it on, but it's personal preference for you whether or not you want it. Persistent effects, though, you want to turn off, because this is similar to bullet impacts, but instead of bullets actually causing the marks on the walls, it's actually caused by things like explosions and fire and all the kind of similar stuff that causes the problems with particle resolution. We do not need that visual clutter in our game, so keep this off. Then moving on, we've got shader quality. This sets how good does lighting look in the game, and it's really unfortunate that we do have to turn this to low. It does make the game look considerably worse because the lighting when you turn these shaders up looks really, really nice, but it has a big impact on FPS, this setting, so it just has to be on low. It's one of the biggest FPS hits of any setting in this list, so yeah, bit of a shame, but keep it on low. Then on-demand texture streaming, a definite one we want to turn off. You'll also have to select yes here to say, yep, I definitely want to turn this off. Downloading textures as we play and using up hard disk space doesn't sound like something we want to touch, so yeah, definitely off on that. And then the last one in this section, local texture streaming quality. This one you want to put to low. I haven't seen any effect in the visuals, and you do gain a small bit of performance. You can see that the effect on GPU and VRAM is actually medium for this. Just can't seem to understand why. I think it's something to do with the quality of textures at range on some of the larger areas when you're looking at range, but we don't care about those, so keep it on low. Now, if you find these kind of videos to be useful or informative to you, then why not consider subscribing down below? It literally takes one click, no effort on your guys' part, and you can change your mind in the future. I'm gonna have a ton of stuff coming up for Season 1 Reloaded and Season 2 when that rolls round that you do not wanna miss. Settings, tips, optimizations, everything you could need that other people are not covering. It's all going to be here on the channel, so subscribe. For shadow and lighting, we're looking at shadow quality. This one's going to be very similar to textures from earlier. Very low looks a lot worse than low, and you don't lose much FPS going up to low. So I'd recommend putting these on low rather than the lowest setting. I just think it looks a lot better. Normal, high, and ultra, they all tank FPS more and more and more, and you're not getting much out of visuals for turning that up. So low's your best balanced option. Screen space shadows, this sets whether shadows are actually rendered in on local surfaces, mainly your gun that you're holding and the hands of your operator. Makes the game look a bit more realistic, but they are completely unnecessary and have a little bit of a hit on FPS, so we'll turn those off. Ambient occlusion sets the shadows that are being generated in these tight areas where objects meet. So you can see here where this car is, you've got much darker areas between the ground being very close to the car and the inner bit of where this wheel would be. Once again, it's just unnecessary and can affect FPS pretty heavily when you've got a lot of these little shadows being rendered in, and also hurts visibility because there's just way more dark areas for people to be in. So turn those off as well. Screen space reflections, gonna sound like a broken record here, but we're gonna turn these off because they are just unnecessary. And static reflection quality, also, we're gonna put them to low. You can't turn them off, so you will still have some sort of reflections being rendered in, but we don't care about them, so we're gonna put them to the lowest. Final section in here is environment. So tessellation, we want to put this to off. Haven't actually seen this have much effect at all. It has this screenshot here. I believe this is on the favela map in multiplayer, but haven't seen any effect on it actually in game. So I've just deemed it to be something that's unnecessary. Then volumetric quality, big effect on FPS. Probably one of, if not the most biggest effects on FPS in the settings menu, so we have to put this to low. Unfortunately, you lose some of that nice lighting, but it also is actually going to hurt your visibility, so it's a win-win here. Then deferred physics quality, this is all to do with the quality of water, which we'll turn to off. Also water quality down here, I know I'm jumping a setting, but you want to turn that off as well because we don't care about water being more wavy and stuff. If anything, we want to be able to just see through water a little bit more. And then the last one, weather grid volumes, we're going to turn them off as well because we don't care about the quality of weather effects. Just making our game as clean and simple as possible. Moving on to the view tab, FOV. This is a little bit of an interesting one because I've always recommended that you max this out. But having had some experience playing on a controller recently, you can actually get a little bit more aim assist when the person that you're shooting at is a little bit bigger on your screen, in which case 110 FOV is actually kind of helpful if you're playing on controller. You might still prefer 120. even if you are playing on controller, and especially if you're playing on keyboard mouse, 120 is going to be the best because there's no aim assist and you need as much information as possible. So pick a value between 110 and 120 and you're going to have a good time. ADS FOV, make sure this is on affected. This way, when we ADS in, we won't have a really tight FOV. We'll still maintain that slightly larger FOV that we gave up here. And it will also help with reducing the overall visual bounce and recoil of the gun when we start shooting. Then weapon field of view. I like wide for this, but it is personal preference. I just like the gun being a little bit further from me and being a little bit smaller on my screen. I feel very claustrophobic playing with default or narrow, but it's up to you guys. Third person FOV, I say it every time, we haven't had third person in the game yet, so it's weird that there's even a setting in here, but I would just recommend that you max this out anyway, because if third person comes at any point and you do play it, you're already going to be set in terms of your settings. And then last one, vehicle FOV, make sure this is on wide so that when we get in a vehicle, we have as much information around us at all times as possible. Then camera, the last section of the in-game settings we're going to cover. World motion blur and weapon motion blur, make sure both of these are off. Motion blur will really hurt with overall visual fidelity in game and visibility. Film grain, turn that all the way down. We are not watching a film, we're playing a game and trying to win, so we do not want that. Then first person and third person camera movement, put both of these to least. It will just reduce the overall amount of camera shake that happens in game. I'm not exactly sure what situations this affects, but any time where the camera shakes, we want it to be as little as possible, just so we can stay looking at enemies and stay focused on the game. Third person ADS transition. This one I would recommend sticking with first person ADS. If you do play third person whenever that comes out, this will just mean that when you ADS, you actually aim down the sight of your gun, meaning you can actually land your shots. If you haven't played third person, it's not going to mean much to you, but just put first person ADS in here. Spectator camera, put this to game perspective. I hate that it defaults to that helmet camera thing. Game perspective is just so much better because I'm actually in the eyes of the person playing. It's just a much better experience and I can be much more helpful to them by pointing out things that maybe they didn't see. And then the last one, inverted flashbang. This makes it so that if you get flashbanged in game, instead of making your screen go white, your screen goes black. This can be nice if you're sensitive to bright white lights, which some people are, but I would recommend most people keep this off so that when your screen goes white, you go, okay, I know I've been flashbanged, as opposed to your screen going black and you thinking, oh, my game's crashed. It wouldn't be a nice death if you died in game thinking that your game crashed. So there we go. That's all of the in-game settings. What we're going to do now is cover the config files outside of the game. So with all the in-game settings applied and that game now closed down, we need to make our way to this folder. So just your documents folder, then Call of Duty, and then players. Inside of here, you're going to have a bunch of different files. The one that we care about is options.4.cod23. You might not see the .cst bit because that's the file extension. So don't worry if you don't see that. What you then want to do to open this up, the most foolproof way, because I've had people before that don't have the edit option, the best way is to open up your search bar, go to Notepad, open that up, and then you want to drag and drop the options for Cod23 file onto that, and you'll see it now opens up. The first setting we're going to change in here is 2 down from the top. It's renderer worker count. We want to set this to the number of physical cores that our CPU has. You can find this out by searching up your CPU online. The reason I recommend doing this is because some of the later Intel CPUs have performance and efficiency cores. And in that case, you just want to select the performance cores. If you try and just go to your task manager and do this, you might see a number that includes those efficiency cores. So search up your CPU on Google, find out how many physical cores it has, not threads, and put that number in here. So I've got an 8-core CPU with 16 threads, so I'm going to put 8 in here. And this is going to give you the best performance in game. No debate about it. The next setting you want to find is corpse limit. If you want to find these settings quickly, you can do Control F and then use the find dialog to type in, for example, corpse and then search for it. What you want to do here is turn this all the way down to 0. By default, this will be set at some finite number, but we want to turn this all the way down. Now, in theory, it says number of AI corpses, so this shouldn't have an effect on Warzone, but just to be safe, turn it down anyway, just so we can get any performance gains in any part of the game that we play. Then show blood effects, turn this to false, just below corpse limit. This is going to turn off blood completely in game, which actually improves visual fidelity quite a bit, so that when you start shooting people, you've not got blood coming out in front of them. You can just see your target at all times. Below that, you've got blood limit and blood limit interval. In theory, these shouldn't be doing anything, assuming that you've got show blood to set to false, but for safety, we're just going to put blood limit to true and then set the interval to the maximum of 2000. So you can just copy from over here into here, and that way blood is limited as much as possible. Just below that, you've got show brass, so we can turn off the bullets coming out of guns. Once again, it just cleans up what we're looking at in game at any time. Then you need to find corpses culling threshold, and you're going to turn this down from the default of 0.85 down to 0.5, and then just add a 0 so that it matches the number of zeros. Once again, just to make it safe. I'm not sure how these config files might handle it if you lose certain amounts of zeros in these numbers. Catmull clock subdivision level, bit of a mouthful that, but we want to turn this down from 3 to the minimum of 0. This should make the game look a lot worse, because this is all to do with the geometry of objects, and the higher this is, the more detailed geometry of objects is. But turning this down to 0 gives a little bit of an FPS boost and doesn't seem to change anything in terms of what we're looking at. So bit confusing on what it's doing, but a nice little hidden setting that not many people know they need to change. And then just a little bit down from that, we've got sun shadow cascade. This one, I'd recommend you copy over this whole string of text. So low 1 cascade, copy that and replace in between the inverted commas over here. This is just going to make sure that the formatting is exactly as the file wants you to do it. This just will turn down basically the overall quality of shadows that come from the sun. It's weird that we can't change this in game, because this one is actually a pretty significant one in terms of performance. And then just a little bit down from that, we've got reflection probe relighting. Turn this down to 1. And then below that, static sun shadow clip map resolution. Turn this from 1024 to 0. Last couple of things we're changing in here. GPU upload heaps. This enables optimizations when resizable bar is supported. This is still a bugged setting. From what I know, it actually causes a lot more stuttering and a lot more 1% lows in your performance. So it's recommended that you still keep this to false. Hopefully in the future they can get this fixed and we can turn this back to true. But for now, I think false is still the best option. And just below that, we've got enable velocity based blur. Yuck, we do not want any blur, so we're going to turn that to false as well. Then a couple of little interesting things in interface, which I like changing. Skip intro and viewed splash screen. I'd recommend skip intro. You turn that to true because we don't want to see that intro every time we open the game. We want to get in game as quick as possible. And then enable the player to skip the splash screen if viewed at least once. Make sure that's true as well, so we don't need to see the splash screen every single time. And then with all that dialed in, all we need to do is press File and Save, and then close the notepad, and that'll all be dialed in. If you do go in game and change around any settings in the graphics that we changed earlier now, you might see some bits of that config file reset. So if you start playing around with graphics, just make sure you keep going back to that config file and making sure everything's dialed in as we just did it. The last things we're going to cover are 2 Windows settings that are really important, not just for COD, but for any game you play on PC. So super important we get these dialed in. First one, we're going to search down here for game mode, then open up game mode settings and make sure that game mode is on. Just overall optimizes Windows for PC gaming. Should be on for everyone, so just check that. Then the next one you want to search for, come down here and search for graphics settings. You can see it's already here for me. Open up that, and you'll have an option in here called Hardware Accelerated GPU Scheduling. You want to make sure that this is set to on. This was actually really bad to have on in Warzone 2. For some reason, this actually made your game perform worse. But testing of Modern Warfare 3 and Warzone 3, or whatever we're calling it now, is that HAGS, or Hardware Accelerated GPU Scheduling, is good. So make sure that is on as well. Now that you've got all those settings dialed in for Season 1 Reloaded, the next thing you need to go and do is watch this video where I cover through 17 hidden mechanics in Warzone 3 that you probably didn't even know you could do. I mean, driving around underwater in a Big Bertha, that sounds pretty cool, doesn't it? You need to go and watch that video to find out how.